There is biology, and then there is cryptobiology. The first is the study of living things. The second is the study of living things that don't exist. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, that sort of thing. Every once in a while, cryptobiology stumbles on something that does exist, and when that happens, everyone gets very excited about it. These videos are like that, except we search for things that don't really exist on maps. Legends like the Kingdom of Prester John, the Great Lake of the West, troglodytes and blemmyes. We give these legends the serious attention they deserve, delving deep into their origins and tracing their development over time. We'll learn a lot of history, the messy kind that the textbooks almost always get wrong. And what we find will never fail to surprise. I love showing off my map collection. I think that all my maps have something special about them. But there's one in my collection that is an absolute knockout. That is, it hits everyone I show it to like a Muhammad Ali punch. It has so many grand and beautiful features. Xanadu, where Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decreed. Lost tribes of Israel, Dan and Naphtali. The golden cities of California. In fact, this was the map that gave California its name. But one feature on this map presents a darker mystery. Historians once insisted that this was impossible, but more and more today believe that what we've been told about the discovery of Hawaii is only half true. The old consensus was that Captain Cook was the first European to chart Hawaii. He found it by accident in 1778 while crossing the Pacific from Christmas Island to Alaska. So how then does a volcanic island chain appear in the middle of the Pacific, right where Hawaii belongs, on a map drawn 200 years earlier? If this is really Hawaii, then we have to push back the history of Europeans and islands by over 2 full centuries. And the real discoverers of Hawaii were not British naval explorers, but Spanish conquistadors. If this is true, much of the history of the Pacific would have to be rewritten, and a whole new set of riddles will be created for historians to solve. It's a serious question, and the old consensus is crumbling. A new consensus is forming. The Spanish hypothesis is put forward as fact in many articles, mostly on touristy websites, but many from real academics. We're going to put both hypotheses to the test. We're going to take a deep dive through all this material cited by both sides. We'll analyze it objectively and determine the answer to 2 questions. Did the Spanish discover Hawaii before Captain Cook? And, more important to me personally, is this map the first printed record of the Hawaiian Islands? Stick with me to the very end. What we're going to find is more surprising than anything I thought possible when I started my research. Even the academic specialists aren't prepared for what I discovered. Welcome to the Eye of History. Here we talk of all things of maps and map collecting. We look at the history of the map and the history on the map, following wherever it leads, into the history of science, technology, economics, politics, warfare, sociology. If you enjoy following the facts wherever they lead, then please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. And leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's get the conversation started. A mystery like this was 500 years in the making, and we aren't going to be satisfied with just a cursory analysis. I have found 5 different threads of evidence, each of which has made a contribution to the mystery. We're going to thoroughly examine each of them with a historian's critical eye and see what they can teach us. We shall begin with the artifact that started this video, the map by Ortelius, and all the maps that followed. We'll compare the maps to each other and to the real world, looking for clues to where cartographers got their information. Next, we will take a close look at how the Spanish used the Pacific and how likely it was that Spanish ships ever encountered the isolated archipelago. We'll look in particular at the Manila Galleons, convoys laden with Chinese silks and American silver which crisscrossed the Pacific every year. Could these famous ships be the key to Spanish discovery? Third, we look at the Spaniard most often credited with finding Hawaii, Juan Gaetano. We'll look closely at the documentary evidence and see what the charts and logs actually say. The evidence is, to be sure, fragmentary, but it is key to our understanding of the mystery and Gaetano's role in history. Next, we will look at Captain Cook's own observations and those of his crew and others who came after. Cook's voyage was recorded in a 3-volume set of reports, and in those pages Cook's crew speculated on possible Spanish artifacts and influences in Hawaii. Other visitors made similar observations, and we'll evaluate all of them as objectively as possible. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we'll look at the history recorded by the Hawaiian people themselves. The kahuna are the Hawaiian priests tasked with maintaining the people's history in the form of ritualized chants, the ole. These ole are passed down from generation to generation and contain the knowledge of centuries. We'll see what these chants can tell us about possible Spanish activity. We shall give the Hawaiian people themselves the last word. But before we start, we need to shed ourselves of our preconceptions and desires. I have to admit, I would personally be gratified if my map was, in fact, the first European map to display the Hawaiian Islands. But I must recognize that bias and do my best to set it aside. Bias, no matter its source, is the greatest barrier to finding truth. Now let's get started. We must start at the beginning, the maps themselves. The mapmaker was Abraham Ortelius, one of the giants of cartography in the late 16th century. Although a Fleming from Antwerp, he would eventually be named the royal geographer to the King of Spain. That job did not actually require him to move to Madrid, but he traveled extensively and built up a formidable network of sources. He was close friends with the most famous cartographer of all time, Gerard Mercator, along with many other cartographers and scholars of his time. He was a man at the apex of his field, living in the center of the intellectual world. Ortelius made this map relatively early in his career, and before the appointment to the King of Spain. It was part of his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, which is often called the first modern atlas. The atlas was extremely successful. It remained in print for over 40 years and inspired countless imitations. The map is titled The Great Hamitic Kingdom of Tartary. I will leave that fascinating association of North Central Asia with the biblical Sons of Ham to some future video. That promises to be a roller coaster ride. But the map extends well beyond the title area. In fact, it covers most of what we call Tibet, China, and Siberia, the North Pacific, and Western North America. The portion we're most interested in today is here, in the Central Pacific. Roughly equidistant from Japan and California, but a bit more southerly, we find these 3 islands, La Farfana, Volcani del Fuego, and Laniani. And in the real world, what do we find roughly equidistant from Japan and California, but a bit more southerly? Volcani del Fuego for sure, the fiery volcanoes of Hawaii. The name Laniani has a clear Hawaiian ring to it. It doesn't sound Spanish or Dutch. And if so many historians didn't insist that Spaniards knew nothing of Hawaii in 1570, almost anyone would assume that's exactly what these islands are. But we can't end our investigation with just this map. We need to see how other cartographers viewed these islands to put Ortelius' map in better perspective. We'll move forward in time and see what we can learn. One thing that we'll see as we move forward is that the Pacific Ocean will get larger with each map. The ancients believed that Asia was much larger than it really is, and the early explorers of the Americas also greatly overestimated the size of North America. Through the decades, we'll see both of these errors slowly corrected, map by map. So 37 years after Ortelius' map, we find another map, this one by another great Flemish cartographer, Hendrik Hondius. Hondius' Pacific Ocean is a bit larger than Ortelius', and our islands are now definitely closer to California than Japan. The islands have also moved several degrees further south. Their latitude is now very close to the real Hawaii's. Laniani has disappeared, and the other 2 have almost switched places. From here on, we find 2 different sets of names applied to the islands, with some minor variations on both traditions. In 1626, we see this map from an Englishman, John Speed. He calls the islands Les Monges, the monks, La Vizina, and La Desgraciada, the unfortunate. Speed wasn't actually the first to use these names. They were used a few years earlier on a globe, but I couldn't locate a graphic of that for this video. You might notice that California is now an island. It would remain an island on most maps for much of the century before finally rejoining the continent. We see both naming traditions throughout the century, although as time wore on, it was the second set of names that became more common. In 1660, we see volcanoes and Farfand. And in 1675, we see Los Monjes, La Vecina, and La Desgraciada again. In 1690, we see two maps from the same cartographer, Frederick de Witt. In one we find Les Monjes, La Vecina, and La Desgraciada. And in the other, none of them. And I should point out that there were many other maps that omitted the islands. In this period, the Pacific was still very much a Spanish lake, and the Spanish crown jealously guarded all geographical information on it. So cartographers were always working from scanty data and making judgment calls regarding what details were important. The biggest variable was longitude, which was extremely difficult to measure. Before the invention of the chronometer, calculating longitude required making difficult astronomical observations. It couldn't be done on just any given day, and certainly not aboard a ship, and even the best measurements could still be off by hundreds of, or even 1,000+ miles. So we should not be surprised to see our islands shift east or west from map to map, as each cartographer made their own interpretations of the vague reports they received. Other islands sometimes appear as well. Here in a map from 1714, we see about 10 degrees further west, Isle Francois and Isle Habiti. Phantom isles like this often appear on multiple maps from different authors, as the competitors were quick to copy each other's works. But none of these other phantoms had the staying power of our mysterious archipelago. Here is a map from 1838, well after James Cook put the real Hawaii onto the globe. It shows both our prototype Hawaii and Hawaii 2.0. We can conclude one thing for certain. Many of the most respected cartographers of the 2 centuries between Ortelius and Cook sincerely believed that an archipelago existed at the same latitude as Hawaii, but misplaced it to the east. Of Ortelius, I've been able to verify the existence of every other island on this map. Not necessarily very accurately, but that's forgivable in a map of this early era. Of the others, it is true that their maps occasionally included mirages, but none of these were repeated so consistently as our archipelago. But sincere belief is not the same as truth, nor does the fact that the islands appear on so many maps. Cartographers in this era plagiarized from each other shamelessly, often publishing near exact copies of other people's maps and changing just the cartouche. None of the maps I've shown reached that level of mimicry. In fact, to their credit, each cartographer made their own adjustments to account for their changing appreciation of the size of the Pacific Ocean. With each new map, the coast of Asia receded westward as explorers realized that the continent was simply not as large as they originally believed. At the same time, the North American coastline evolved as new information trickled in. With each adjustment, our islands moved a little, according to the cartographer's judgment. They weren't just copying blindly. And for some reason, a new set of names appeared. This is very unusual, particularly as both sets of names are Spanish. Usually such changes are due to political differences, like Captain Cook renaming them again as the Sandwich Isles. It may just be a mistake on Ortelius's part being fixed by later cartographers. Let's make a note of this shift as we examine the rest of the evidence. To sum up, it seems that the maps alone can't get us the full truth. We shouldn't be surprised by that. The Spanish Empire considered the Pacific their sovereign territory and jealously guarded it against incursion from every other European country, even the Spanish Netherlands, where Ortelius lived. Data on any island, coast, current, or wind were state secrets. Ortelius and our other cartographers relied on networks of friends and informants for information, and we know a lot of these people, but not one of the sources that we know of would have had access to the secret information. All of them, Ortelius included, were working from second, third, maybe fourth-hand reports. We'll need a lot better sources than Ortelius had if we want to solve this mystery. Through the 16th century, as far as the Europeans were concerned, the Pacific was effectively a Spanish lake. Rivals couldn't enter from the Atlantic, The Straits of Magellan were too dangerous to be used routinely. They couldn't enter from the west. The logistics were just too daunting. Spain controlled both the Philippines and the Pacific coast of the Americas, so their European competitors were all but locked out. This monopoly made it possible for Spain to engage in one of the most unlikely trade routes in history, the Manila Galleons. The basis of the trade was straightforward. The Americans had silver, the most productive mines in history, which China greatly needed. To this, the Spanish would add a few other commodities like cacao and tobacco, even wine, if for no other reason than to fill the space on the massive 1,000-ton ships. China had everything else, everything that the colonial elites in the Americas wanted, and what Europe wanted as well. Silks, of course, porcelain, lacquerware, spices, an enormously valuable set of cargoes. So every year, the galleons would leave the dusty port of Acapulco and cross the Pacific to Manila. There they would unload the silver and take on the silks and spices brought to Manila from China and elsewhere. After waiting for the best weather, the galleons would cross the Pacific again. At first glance, you might think that the Manila galleons could not have helped but discover Hawaii. Acapulco is at 17 degrees latitude, Manila at 14.5 degrees latitude. Just taking the straight line route would bring the ships to within just 200 miles of the Big Island. That's not quite close enough to see Mauna Loa or Mauna Kea, but it's close enough to see clouds over the islands if the conditions are right, and any galleon that strayed even a little to the north would be guaranteed to discover the islands. So surely the galleons discovered Hawaii. As it happened, the galleons did not take a straight line route to and from Manila and Acapulco. Instead, they first found latitudes in which the prevailing winds and currents were favorable. They left Acapulco in February, more or less, and always started by jogging south to about 13 degrees latitude, where the wind and current were ideal. They obviously would not return by that route. Instead, they left Manila in July, plus or minus, to take advantage of seasonal monsoon winds to propel them north, as far as 44 degrees north, safely past the dreaded horse latitudes. That's a zone of unpredictable winds that lurks around 30 degrees. Only when safely past that dreaded region did they turn to the east. So it isn't all that surprising that the galleons regularly missed Hawaii. They came closest on their westward journey, missing the islands by at least 600 miles, but the westward journey was the easy leg, with predictable winds and few storms. They didn't often fall off course. The eastward journey was hellish, generally taking twice as long and risking both storms and becalmings. But that leg never came within 1,000 miles of Hawaii. And with the horse latitudes standing between the galleon route and Hawaii, a galleon in trouble would beat back northward rather than enter that risky patch of sea. So we can't simply assume the galleons ever encountered Hawaii. We do know this, though. It is not likely that Ortelius learned of Hawaii from anyone on the galleons. The first Manila galleon didn't sail until 1565, just 5 years before Ortelius published this map. It doesn't seem plausible that in the short amount of time between the start of the galleons and Ortelius' map, the Fleming managed to obtain such sensitive information. It's harder to discount the possibility that the galleons did on occasion sight the islands, and this may account for some of the adjustments we see in later maps. In addition to their cargo, the galleons also often carried missionaries, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, men who might talk about the things they saw at sea with little thought to Spanish secrecy. Perhaps the name change that we noted in 1625 was due to one of these men, someone who would not have known the names on the pilot's charts and thus made up his own. That seems plausible. But it isn't exactly the discovery we're looking for. We don't usually credit a discovery to anyone who sails by at some great distance, and it doesn't tell us how the islands got on the map in the first place. For that, we'll have to look at the man they say put Hawaii on the map. When a name is given to the Spaniard who first discovered Hawaii, it is always Juan Gaetano. Of the man we know next to nothing, but as the navigator of one of the most important voyages of discovery in Pacific history, we know much more. That is because Gaetano wrote the book on an expedition he did not command and for which he was not listed as either a captain or a pilot. That isn't to say he wasn't on the expedition, only to point out the incongruity of his name being so attached to the discovery. The expedition was commissioned by the Viceroy of New Spain in 1541 and consisted of 6 ships commanded by Ruy López de Villalobos. Its mission was to colonize the Philippines as well as to scout the trans-Pacific routes. The convoy discovered a couple of the islands on the Ortelius map, such as Roca Petida, and some too far south to be on this map, including various atolls in the Marshall and Caroline Islands, and more islands in the Philippines and Moluccas. Once the flotilla reached the Philippines, however, everything went sideways for Lopez. Dogged by lack of supplies and threatened by a Portuguese governor who was not impressed by Spanish claims to the islands, Lopez attempted to send a ship back to New Spain to get help. That expedition would discover a few more islands, but it wouldn't make the crossing. In fact, no ship succeeded in crossing Pacific west to east until 1565, which makes the Polynesian navigational achievements centuries earlier seem even more impressive. Lopez ended up dying in a Portuguese prison, but Juan Gaetano and about 80 others eventually made it back to Spain. Gaetano's account was published in 1550 in Italy, in a travel book noted for also featuring the first mention of tea in European literature. The published account does not seem to support the idea that Gaetano discovered Hawaii. Judging from the islands that have been absolutely identified, the flotilla crossed the Pacific at about the 10th parallel, well south of Hawaii. The names do not match either set of names that we see on our maps, nor do the descriptions given by Gaetano match Hawaii at all. So Gaetano himself did not claim to discover Hawaii. It is, of course, more than a little silly to credit Gaetano with discovering anything. He wasn't captain or pilot. His main accomplishment was simply to survive and be the one to record the narrative. But it turns out that the report published in Italy was not the only record of Gaetano's achievement. We shouldn't be surprised that the Spanish archives might have held additional documents, charts and reports, long hidden from the rest of the world. Only after Spain's claims on the Pacific had been abandoned could such documents come to light. The first such document was revealed in 1743, when a British captain, George Anson, captured a Spanish galleon on the Pacific. With the galleon's treasure, he also obtained the galleon's charts, and on this top-secret chart was our archipelago, at the proper latitude, but about 10 degrees east of Hawaii. This matches the maps we've been seeing quite well, but the Spanish chart named the largest La Mesa, a different name, a difference which will help us connect these islands to Gaetano. We don't have the original chart, but we have something close. This map, made in 1787, documents Anson's mission and the chart he plundered. The map even shows La Mesa and the other islands in their purported location, 10 degrees east of Hawaii. At the time, it was still considered possible that La Mesa existed. It wasn't until 2 years later that a French expedition under the Comte de Leperouse proved conclusively that that spot of ocean was empty. The second document was revealed to the world in an article in a Quaker magazine, The Friend, in 1873. It is a letter dated 1865 from the Spanish Hydrographical Department, that is, the bureau that makes the sea charts. The letter states that in their possession is an old manuscript chart displaying the Hawaiian Islands and explicitly crediting Juan Gaetano with their discovery. A third document was reported decades later, again by The Friend magazine. An article in 1927 reported of a letter from the Spanish Colonial Office to the governor of the Philippines. This letter repeats the claims in the 1865 letter, but adds more detail. Among the details is the name, La Mesa. It all seems to tie together. We have an actual Spanish chart with the islands and La Mesa. And we have 2 letters describing another chart with the same islands, with the same names, and credit for their discovery given explicitly to Gaetano. If only we had the original chart in our hands. If its age and provenance were what we imagine, it would settle the issue once and for all. We don't have the mysterious chart in hand, but fortunately for us, we have a way to date it anyway, from a detail in the second letter, the letter from the Colonial Office. It says, quote, "The principal proof is an old manuscript chart, registered in these archives as anonymous, and in which the Sandwich Islands are laid down under that name, but which also contains a note declaring that he called them Islas de Mesa." End quote. The map contained the Sandwich Islands, and by that name. The chart did not predate Captain Cook. It simply repeated the same mistake that was common on ordinary maps. The manuscript map only proves that secret Spanish charts of that time were as flawed as their public competitors, which we already knew. We saw that on the chart that Captain Anson had captured. Now, we don't have that manuscript chart, but we do have the British equivalent, a map that might have inspired the missing chart or been inspired by it. This map was published in 1799 and shows both the Sandwich Islands and La Mesa and its siblings. Being British, our map does not mention Gaetano. That tidbit must have been added to the chart by a proud Spaniard. Interestingly enough, our British map reports the Mindanao sighted land near Hawaii in 1568. This would be just as remarkable as Gaetano's discovery, but it's not true. The expedition of Alvaro de Mindanao in 1568 discovered a number of islands, but never came near Hawaii's latitude. This is a good example of why you should be skeptical of random comments that you find on old maps. So the Spanish charts are cooked. They're evidence of nothing other than the fact that the Spaniards were as mistaken as everyone else on the issue. What is interesting is how later writers misinterpreted the reports in the Friend. Look at this progression and how Gaetano's discovery has been described. Remember that Gaetano's personal account was not a secret. It was printed in a popular book in 1570. In 1892, we get a straightforward description of the discovery of some Pacific atolls, likely in the Marshall or Caroline Islands. Nothing in this report suggests that Gaetano discovered Hawaii. The account provides the latitude and a description of the environment and people. In 1923, we get this account. The names have changed, and the islands have grown from atolls into large mesas that reach the clouds. The details of the environment are gone. We get both La Mesa and Le Desgraciado, even though those two names only appear together in the later maps. There's another detail to note here. He only references a chart, not the text of Gaetano's published report. The author could only be talking about the chart hidden in the Spanish archives, a chart he has never seen and which was never claimed to be by Gaetano's hand, but he is confident in describing its contents. Finally, we get an enthusiastic account in 2014. Now we have Gaetano's map matching the real islands almost perfectly, and the latitudes are super close. The mysterious chart in the Spanish archives has now morphed into incontrovertible proof of Gaetano's chart-making virtuosity. I researched this particular paper way too deeply, and I'll spare you the details. Suffice it to say, the quotes are invented, and our author was working from the same sources as the other two authors above. Juan Gaetano was one of Spain's most successful explorers. He surely deserves credit for discovering something in the Western Seas, either the Marshall or Caroline Islands. So when Captain Cook discovered Hawaii and various Spaniards realized that the islands on their charts that no one had laid eyes on in centuries, it was natural for them to credit their most famous explorer from that early period of Spanish dominance. At least one man in the hydrography department made it explicit, just as we see in the British map of that time. From there, it just took a letter from the department, translated in a somewhat confusing way, to establish Gaetano's purported discovery as a fact in the minds of many. It seems to have happened between the 1890s and the 1920s. The myth only expanded from there. Let's sum this up. The only evidence that Juan Gaetano discovered Hawaii is an anonymous, handwritten note dating from after 1778. That note being on a now missing nautical chart. The evidence against that claim is Juan Gaetano's own account, published just a few years after the fact. The verdict is clear. Juan Gaetano did not discover Hawaii. But that just deepens our mystery. If Gaetano didn't put the islands on the map, who did? Well, James Cook, of course. But Cook wasn't so sure he was the first. James Cook's expedition was truly a voyage of exploration. He did not expect to discover Hawaii. He was simply taking a shortcut between Kiribati, Christmas Island, and Alaska. Hawaii just happened to be in his way. But he was well prepared anyway, and he and his crew had 3 months on the islands to study the islands and the people. His crew included a well-regarded naturalist, William Anderson, who also had some expertise in ethnography. It was Anderson's job to gather all the information he could on Polynesian language, agriculture, and society, and he had already learned a lot from the expedition's previous visits to Tonga, Tahiti, and other islands. Anderson was already Britain's foremost expert in Polynesian culture before he landed on Hawaii. Now, Cook and Anderson both speculated that the Spanish had beaten them to the islands. They were led towards that conclusion by quite a bit of evidence. Specifically, they cited the following. First, the Hawaiians were using iron implements and weapons, though the island had no source of the metal. Second, the Hawaiian language contained words from Spanish. And third, they noted a number of trivial coincidences, which we'll get into in a moment. The iron implements included iron knives, which the Hawaiians valued highly, daggers, fish hooks, and awl. One of the Spanish-sounding words they noticed was their word for iron, hamaite, which they noted was close to the Spanish word for iron ore, hematitas. And it wasn't just Cook and his crew that noted such correlations. Later visitors noted that the Hawaiian word pono, which means right, sounds suspiciously close to bueno, or good in Spanish. Poco, Hawaiian for short, is the same as the Spanish word for small. Among the more trivial coincidences they noted were that the Hawaiians' feather garments looked something like the frilly collars that the Spanish used to wear. They compared the Hawaiians' plumed helmets with the Spanish helmets, and thought a certain stone statue looked a bit like a Spanish nobleman. Frankly, none of these casual observations stand up to the slightest scrutiny. And honestly, they're a bit insulting, as they suggest that Hawaiian clothing and art were merely imitative, rather than being the product of a rich and venerable indigenous culture. Plumed helmets aside, Cook's other observations do deserve some respect, and some serious scrutiny. In addition to the fishhooks and such, the iron implements that the Cook expedition observed include 2 small knives. They were able to identify them as Japanese in origin, the sort of knives used by fishermen. This was an important discovery. We know that from 1639 on, Japan was closed to almost all foreign trade. Although the Spanish called on Japanese ports in the period before the shogun closed off the country, these sorts of simple knives were not among the trade goods. These knives could only have washed up on the Hawaiian shore, attached to some half-sunken fishing sampan or caught in a floating net. And so too with the rest of the iron. According to Cook and Anderson, the weapons and tools were fairly obviously adapted from nails and bolts. And the amounts were so small, they clearly arrived in flotsam, not from trade. Other than the Japanese knives, Cook's men saw no finished goods, no blades forged by Spaniards, only scraps that were pounded into useful shapes by the Hawaiians themselves. As for the vocabulary, etymology is tricky. Any list of vocabulary words is going to present some coincidences, and discerning real connections from happenstance requires serious analysis. In this case, it doesn't require much analysis at all to prove Anderson and Cook wrong. The Spanish word for iron is fierro. Hematitas is the word for iron ore. Hawaii has no iron ore, and Hawaiians knew nothing of smelting, so it's hard to imagine a conversation in which a Hawaiian would ask what this iron material is called, and the Spaniard would respond with the name of the ore instead. And it turns out that hamaite is not even the word for iron. It's ho. The whole account is a complete misunderstanding. As for the poco bueno connection, again, just because 2 words sound alike doesn't mean they are related. You would think that Englishmen would understand that instinctively. We merely need to look at other Polynesian languages, such as Maori, to see whether pono and poco were native words or imports from Spain. And sure enough, pono means straight or true in Maori. Poko means short, just like it does in Hawaiian. These are Polynesian words. Cook did report on one other item that suggested a Spanish presence in Hawaii, but it wasn't Cook or his crew that made the connection. Cook reported that one of the Hawaiian staple crops was the sweet potato, a crop that originated in South America. In the 1930s, an American anthropologist named John Stokes realized that the sweet potato had to have been introduced to Hawaii somehow, and the only reasonable idea he could imagine was that it was brought by visiting Spaniards. Until recently, it was the most powerful argument for Spanish contact that historians had. Now, at the time, there were some good reasons to be skeptical of Stokes' theory. The sweet potato appears in some of Hawaii's oldest myths, myths about the very creation of Hawaii. Its elaborate cultivation has a vocabulary of its own, and charms and chants that surround it, all of which use the most archaic forms of the Hawaiian speech. None of this is compatible with the idea that the sweet potato was a recent innovation brought by a foreign people. Today, we have conclusive proof that Stokes was wrong. Genetic analysis has proven that the Polynesians had acquired the sweet potato at least 1,000 years ago, before the Polynesians had settled Hawaii. The sweet potato really was with the Hawaiians at the time of their creation. Let's sum up. Every metal artifact observed by Cook, Anderson, or any subsequent visitor is best explained as having washed up with floating debris. Most were probably from Asian fishing boats and fishing nets, but we can't eliminate the possibility that some came from Spanish shipwrecks. None appear to have been obtained by trade, gift, or theft. At the time of Cook's landing, not a single word in the Hawaiian language was derived from Spanish. Cook was surprised to discover Hawaii. He was surprised to find an entire archipelago smack dab in the middle of the ocean with islands as large and populated as Hawaii, and he could not imagine that Spain had never visited. To Cook, it seemed much more likely that Spain knew of Hawaii all along, but kept it secret from their European rivals, than that the Spaniards had been sailing around it for 2 full centuries and never found it. He interpreted the evidence to fit his preconception, a mistake that hopefully we won't repeat today. It's now time to bring up the most important evidence. As promised, we shall give the last word to the Hawaiians themselves. The Hawaiians did not have any way to write things down, but that doesn't mean that they didn't know their own history. The islanders have a rich tradition in which specialized priests and composers, kahuna and hakumele, used chants and stories to keep their history alive. These methods are no joke. Historians have learned to take oral history seriously. Some care is required in their analysis, but the same is true for written records as well. And what do the kahuna tell us in their chants, their oli? One story tells of a foreign vessel being shipwrecked with 2 survivors, a captain and his sister. The oli claims that these 2 were welcomed into Hawaiian society, and some prominent Hawaiian families include them in their genealogy. A second oli tells a similar story, this time of 3 men and 2 women being shipwrecked in a painted boat with a canopy over the stern. One of the men described as the white chief with a shiny knife. A Maui chief, Wakalana, personally rescued them from the storm in an outrigger canoe. The captain carried a long sword which was trumpeted in the stories as the wonderful dagger. These stories line up nicely with a bit of written European history. Immediately after Hernando Cortez conquered Mexico, he fitted out a small squadron, 3 ships, 110 men, and sent them out in the Pacific to assist their countrymen in the Moluccas, about 10,000 miles away. This was 1527, just 6 years after Magellan's circumnavigation. It was a chaotic expedition, and just 1,000 miles into the journey, a tempest scattered the squadron. 1 ship made it across the Pacific, the other 2 were lost forever. Many people believe that one or both ended up in Hawaii. So were the shipwrecked brother and sister, or the white chief with a shiny knife, part of Cortez's squadron? It seems a little odd in that both oli mention women prominently, and it's very unlikely that there were any women aboard these 3 ships. It is vaguely possible that a few native women were impressed as cooks. That was occasionally the case, but certainly no captain took his sister to sea on a military expedition. So we'll dispense with the idea that these shipwrecks were connected to Cortez. The first story, of the captain and his sister, is still more than plausible. The Oli places the event at about 100 years after Cortez, about 1600, so the pair could be from a shipwrecked Manila galleon. Unfortunately, that also places it after the Ortelius map, and possibly after the Speed map as well, so it's too late to explain anything. As for the white chief with a shiny knife, we have the opposite problem. That Oli places this story in the 13th century, over 200 years before any Europeans were plying the Pacific. This must have been a much more recent event. The mention of women indicates that it must have been a party from one of the Manila galleons, which did take on a few women as passengers. But if so, this story is also too late to explain anything. Moreover, both of these stories are of shipwrecks. There are no stories of visitors who came to Hawaii and left again, and definitely no stories of repeated visitors. In fact, there are no stories of even sighting a foreign vessel. And if a Hawaiian had ever laid eyes on one of the massive galleons, it certainly would have inspired a new chant. So all the kahuna can tell us is that at least twice foreigners were shipwrecked on Hawaii. That's not surprising or controversial. It would be hard to imagine 200 years passing in that storm-racked sea without any shipwrecks reaching the islands, but it explains nothing regarding our map. In fact, it deepens the mystery, since the lack of any stories of actual visitors is very suggestive that no Spaniard ever came close enough to the islands to make any meaningful observations. What is most striking is that there were so few such stories, but we should remember that the route that passed closest to Hawaii, the east to west route, was relatively swift and safe. Most shipwrecks occurred on the return trip, and most of those in the typhoon-prone seas near the Philippines and the Marianas. The currents in those areas would carry wrecks away from Hawaii, not towards it. And vessels that foundered further along on their way to Acapulco would be carried by the currents not to Hawaii, but to the coast of North America. Wrecks have been found in Oregon and California, but not a single timber from a Manila galleon has ever been discovered in Hawaii. So the last word from the Hawaiians is this: wrecks were rare, visitors never came at all. And it turns out this lack of data is the final clue we need to unravel this whole mystery. So we really have no good evidence that the Spanish had any knowledge of Hawaii. The most compelling bits of evidence are the maps, which is to say, the evidence is not compelling at all. For my map, the Ortelius, it's worse. Besides being the oldest, based on scantier data, and filled with other questionable features like the land of Argon and the California cities of gold, Ortelius's map places our little archipelago at about 27 degrees latitude. That's a huge mistake for any navigator. The sort of error that an experienced navigator would catch with his naked eye, just looking at the stars on the horizon. It appears as though Hondius corrected Ortelius with his map 37 years later, but it is a striking error. But maybe the mistake is ours. For assuming that because Ortelius's islands are in the center of his Pacific, the real islands are also in the middle of the Pacific. But maybe Ortelius placed the islands not based on their position relative to the Pacific Ocean, but relative to something he knew better, like Japan. We can check. Let's see what is southeast of Japan at 27 degrees north latitude. Sure enough, there's something here. The Ogasawara Islands, 30 volcanic isles, all uninhabited at that time. And discovered by Bernardo de la Torre in 1543, 27 years before our map was printed. The discovery was included in Gaetano's memoir, credited to de la Torre. And what did de la Torre call his discovery? Farfana. So Ortelius had it exactly right. It was the man who copied him, Hondius, who moved the island south and created the confusion with Hawaii. He moved it down to 21 degrees latitude, close to where Hawaii really is. He also moved it eastward, or more precisely, he moved Japan and the rest of Asia westward, putting Farfana on the California side of the Pacific. It's easy to see why Hondius would have associated Farfana with California. He apparently wasn't familiar with Gaetano's account of De La Torre's discovery and did not realize that De La Torre was exploring near Japan. He likely associated Farfana with Gaetano's other discoveries, like Roca Partida near California. He assumed that Ortelius had placed Farfana based on its distance from California, and when he widened the Pacific, Farfana ended up moving to the other side of the ocean. That seems to be a simple cartographic mistake. But why would Hondius move Farfana hundreds of miles southward to the 21st parallel? He surely had good reason, and I suspect that he had obtained reports, rumors, of an archipelago at that lower latitude. A single sighting of the real Hawaii is all it would take. A single Manila galleon being taken off course, followed by a single passenger taking the news back to Europe. Perhaps it was a missionary, as all the major Catholic orders were involved in proselytizing the Philippines. Cartographers like Hondius always had their ears out and always had many friends, particularly among the missionaries. All Hondius needed to hear was a single whisper: volcanic island seen at 21 degrees north. A rumor too vague for the Spanish crown to notice or suppress. Hondius published in 1607. The first map showing the Isles de Mesa appeared shortly afterwards and placed them right where Hondius had placed Farfana. Perhaps the name change was due to another sighting, or perhaps more information from the first sighting was leaking out. The new arrangement would be repeated on map after map for the next 2 centuries, with apparently very little concern that no ships were ever heard to call upon the unfortunate archipelago. That Farfana was missing from its actual location was rarely noticed. Farfana and its siblings were completely useless to the Spanish, with no good natural harbor and very little water. They were rarely revisited. Eventually, we see Farfana return to the Pacific in its proper location, fixing one mistake while camouflaging the other. Is this what happened? We'll likely never know for sure. The rumors were likely never written down, save perhaps in personal notes or private letters, and 4 full centuries have gone by. But it is the simplest theory, the theory that requires the fewest assumptions. It requires only 1 or 2 sightings by an off-course galleon, a missionary being on board to carry the rumor, and a cartographer to hear it. If it's true, then the irony is that none of the maps before Cook's discovery showed Hawaii at all. Rather, they showed the Ogasawara Islands, badly misplaced. It's a surprise, something that no one expected, especially me. It's not the answer I was hoping for at the start, but after having some time to think about, I find it even more satisfying than if my map did show Hawaii, because the story is important here. The story shows us how knowledge proceeds from error to error. We all work with uncertain information, and we all reach flawed conclusions, and we all hope to correct our mistakes and improve. We expect that each correction will bring us closer to the truth, but it doesn't always. And once in a while, something or someone comes along and wipes out everything we thought we knew and replaces it with a far better truth. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. It's your support that makes videos like this possible. And please, leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what struck you about this video and what legends you would like to see investigated next.